Greetings, Mandrake Road family. After a couple of weeks of craziness, things have finally settled down, and we are now getting back to our weekly Sabbath discussions. And so we finished up our last video, finished up the Old Testament texts for now. We're going to come back to Genesis 2 when we, at the end of this particular series. But for now, we're going to move on to the New Testament. And one of the things that has come up as part of the discussions is to practice or not practice Sabbath and how that relates to the law and Jesus. And so what we're going to do is talk about why are we talking about Sabbath and what exactly does Sabbath mean for, as Christians. The question of practicing Sabbath is one that has been discussed for 2,000 years. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Romans 14 and just a few verses where Paul is discussing in the midst of a Jewish Christian and Gentile Christian context the practice of Sabbath. And so we're going to go ahead and read that text, and then we'll discuss a little bit about why it's important. So this is Romans 14, 5 and 6. Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. Also those who eat, eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God, while those who abstain, abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. And so what we're seeing here is this struggle of certain practices. And as we know, Jews had certain eating habits that were related to Torah, and then also practicing Sabbath, the seventh day from sundown to sundown. There is no, from Friday night to Saturday night, there is no, you're not to do any work. And as we've discussed, that's not necessarily just the idea of not working. There's some intention behind that. But what we have here is a situation where you have people who are still, even though they've come under the umbrella of Jesus and faith in Jesus as a defining factor of their community, their culture and their backgrounds don't just disappear. And so what we see, this is similar to what we see in 1 Corinthians 8, where Paul starts talking about the weak and the strong eating food or not eating food offered to idols. And so what we're seeing here is a similar situation, and the question of what people are eating, whether it's good or bad, or practicing Sabbath or not practicing Sabbath. And so the issue here is that Paul says it's to do this, that those who do practice these things do it in honor of the Lord, which is very different than practicing it because, or questioning someone's non-practice of it because of some sort of adherence to what we would call the law, or in this case for Paul, something he wants to avoid is that Gentile Christians are not questioning or denigrating Jewish Christians based on their practices, which may include Torah practices, but also that Jewish Christians are not excluding Gentile Christians because they're not practicing Torah. So we see this in Galatians, and that is outlined quite a bit there, and it's outlined quite a bit here in Romans as well. But I want to get to, so what does this look like for Sabbath? Well, the issue is practicing Sabbath as a means of legalism, or doing it because it feels like it's obligatory towards God, is different than practicing it for the sake of having a relationship with God, the God who rests, as we will see in Genesis 2. but also the one that gives that Sabbath has principles and ideas that go beyond just the idea of not working. And so that's what I hope we can go forward with as we continue to look at texts. We're going to look at a few texts in the New Testament, and then we're going to go back to Genesis 2, is that this is not a matter of law versus grace or law versus faith. This is a matter of what does Sabbath mean? And as we've seen, its principles and the idea and the concept of Sabbath are much broader than just avoiding a day of work. That rest is something that is important and it's necessary. And so the question of is do we set aside a day is something that I've talked about various practices that I do, and I try to set aside a day for various reasons. But Sabbath is not just about setting aside 24 hours or picking a time or even practicing from sundown to sundown from Friday night to Saturday night, which if people do those things, that is perfectly fine. And that's great. That doesn't work for my schedule. And I don't think the issue is whether or not we can set aside 24 hours. Sabbath is something that can be practiced daily if necessary. Some people don't have a full 24 hours to do that kind of work, and or that, no pun intended, to do that, to have a day where they practice Sabbath. The whole idea here is that take time to intentionally rest. Take time to get away from the maddening pace of our world, to move away from making pragmatic decisions about work and life and family, and to think more deeply and reflect more on the God of creation, who creates in 6 days and then creates everything in 6 days and then rests. And we see this idea of creation in 6 days, but creation took 7 days. Rest was a part of creation. It was an integral part from the very beginning. The God who never grows weary, as we see in Isaiah, is the one who rests, who demonstrates for us what rest looks like. And so I hope as we continue these conversations, we can think beyond this idea of practicing Sabbath or as a matter of thinking Old Testament, New Testament, because Sabbath is an important idea that you see in both testaments, and it's a concept, not just a practice or a thing. And so hopefully we can think beyond that, and we can think more about Sabbath in terms of an idea and a practice that shapes us more into who God has called us to be. Because Jesus practiced Sabbath. He didn't practice it the way that other religious authorities would have preferred, but he practices Sabbath. He does many things that everyday Jews would have done at the time: attend synagogue, be in community, and so the question would be is, what does this look like for us? And so that's what I'm hoping we can think about this week. We're going to start looking at Jesus in the Gospels, and we have a couple of texts that we're going to look at, one from Mark and one from Luke, and then we're going to look at Hebrews, which is an oft ignored book, but also one that offers an interesting take on Sabbath. And then we're going to look at Genesis. And then we'll have one more week where we kind of tie some of these things together. So be thinking as you get ready to do your discussions this week about more the idea of Sabbath as a concept or an idea, not just something that is something that we find in the law that is to be done or not done as by divine mandate. And so that's what I hope we can talk about this week. And so as you think about Sabbath, think about this idea, but think about it in terms of what does this look like as far as my time goes? And this is something that I struggle with, and I've talked about in past videos about needing a schedule and a routine and those kinds of things. And those are all good things to have. That's not to say they're bad. It's that Sabbath helps me to learn to think beyond those things in a way that sees the possibility of serving God in different ways when I let go of those things to some degree. And I want to talk more about that in the coming weeks, but think about this idea of time and think about how Sabbath might impact our understanding of time. And so I'm going to expand on this in the coming weeks, but hopefully you're all doing well, and I hope that we can hit the ground running again and get back to it this week with our discussions. We'll see you later, and have a good rest of the week.